Hey there guys, it's Mr. Herbst here, and today our focus is going to be on what shapes an ecosystem. So we're going to talk about the relationship that animals have with each other, such as, predators catching its prey, also relationships that organisms have with their environment, and ultimately kind of how environments are sort of shaped. Before I go into that, let's make sure that we review biotic and abiotic factors. Biotic factors, remember to use your root words. Bio means life. So biotic factors are life factors. Those are all the living things in an environment that are capable of interacting and sort of shaping what an ecosystem looks like. That is the opposite of abiotic factors. Remember, when you put the letter A in front of things, it means like the opposite. Abiotic are non-living things that shape ecosystems. So some really good examples of those things are, things like the air, the water, the temperature, anything that is pretty much non-living that allows organisms to live in that specific environment. I'm going to talk for a second about this concept called biodiversity. I really want to make sure that we're comfortable with that root word there, diversity. Diversity means like a variation, a lot of different kinds. So biodiversity is the variety of all of the forms of life that exist in an ecosystem. And in order for an ecosystem to be stable, there has to be a lot of different forms of life. If there was only one form of life, that one form of life is going to explode. So all of those food webs and relationships between all those different kinds of organisms really helps to keep things stable in nature. My next focus is going to be on habitats and niches. First off, a habitat is basically where an organism lives. It includes both the abiotic and biotic factors. So if an organism lives in a desert environment, it's very hot and dry there. That's an abiotic factor in that organism's environment. If something lives in a humid climate, that is an abiotic factor that allows that organism to live there. The thing about habitats is that they can change in an instant, either naturally or by interference with man. Us, human beings, have actually been doing a lot of damage. If you take a look over here, this dump truck here is carrying a lot of trees. Those trees are not being cut down naturally. Human beings did that. We are destroying habitats. The next focus is going to be on a niche. A niche is sort of the role or the position a species has in its own little environment. So this clownfish here, you wouldn't find that clownfish living out in the middle of the ocean. No, its little niche, its little role there is to live in the sea anemone. The sea anemone gets a little bit of a meal, and the clownfish gets cleaned off. That's its little niche, its tiny little area of its habitat. An ecological niche includes all the factors that a species needs to survive, stay healthy, and reproduce. Those can include things like food, the abiotic conditions, like I just mentioned, and also the behaviors. And I want to kind of ask you guys here, this is more of a question, why do you think no two species really kind of ever share the same niche? For example, why don't you really ever see two birds sort of living in the same area? Well, it happens because one species is always going to be better suited to a specific niche than the other, and the other will kind of get pushed out. So here's another kind of example, is that certain flowers have very specific pollinators. Flowers are shaped based on what will pollinate them. I want to talk for a second about community interactions. This is when organisms live together and they are interacting constantly. For example, this bird over here is catching a fish, and it is doing a very good job of catching that fish. That is a predator-prey relationship, which we'll talk about in a second. But organisms, all the life forms in an ecosystem, all interact constantly on a daily basis. So that brings me to my next point. What types of interactions can we have? Well, there can be this thing called competition, where it occurs when organisms fight for a limited resource. That can either be, say, over here, if we take a look, that these zebras are fighting, probably I'm going to assume for the access to mates. And these tigers over here are definitely fighting for the access to mates. But organisms also do fight over food. Chimpanzees have been known to be very greedy and hoard their food. And so there is going to be a winner and a loser. It's kind of sad to think about, but the winner, it will be the one that survived, and the loser will be the one that probably is not going to survive or survive very easily. Sounds like natural selection to me. In our last unit, we discussed all about survival of the fittest. That is competition. So, how do species avoid competition? I mean, competition, a little healthy competition is good, but if organisms were constantly competing, then probably organisms would start to die out pretty quickly. Well, they do this by avoiding one another. They basically try to separate each other, either by space or by land. So there is a really good example of this. Let's say that right in here is a pine tree. Well, on this pine tree are different layers. We have the top layer, the middle layer, and the bottom layer. Well, there has been these certain species of birds that have actually evolved to live on those specific areas. So this top bird lives right in here. They're called warblers. Kind of a funny name. This middle bird here lives in the middle sections of the tree, and this bird here lives in the lower sections of the tree. That sort of became its own little niche and habitat. And so they evolved to live in very specific parts of the tree. Other types of interactions we can have are predation. I talked a little bit about predator-prey relationships. This occurs when one organism eats another. So snakes eating mice or rats, that's an example of predation. That's an interaction going on in an ecosystem. Then we can also have symbiosis. Symbiosis is where organisms are living closely together, either on the inside or on the outside. And there's really actually three types of symbiosis. There can be mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. I'm going to start by talking about mutualism. That is where, if you think about the term mutual is where, like, it's a good thing, where both species sort of benefit from that relationship. So over here, these butterflies, they get nectar from the flowers. The butterflies, the flowers will go ahead and get pollinated. I also briefly touched on the clownfish example down here. Nemo over here, he gets a bath, and that anemone gets a meal. And another really good example of mutualism is in your own colon. There is bacteria in there that is breaking down food that you cannot. And that gives us vitamin K. We give that bacteria a nice, comfortable, humid place to live. Another type of symbiosis is called commensalism. This is where one member of the association, I guess we'll call it, benefits, and the other is neither help nor harm. So it's like one gets the benefit, one does nothing. A really good example of that is eyelash lice. This right here is a microscopic mite that lives in your eyelashes. You don't really get itchy or doesn't cause any allergic reactions or any problems to you, but you give that organism a nice place to live. And it feeds off of your dead skin, gets a nice meal in the process. There's also a type of symbiosis called parasitism. This is where one organism benefits and the other organism is directly harmed. A really good example of that, and hopefully nobody that you know or yourself has ever had one of these things. This is called a tapeworm. Tapeworms live inside of your intestines. If you have one, they will munch up your food that you eat, and thus making you lose weight and causing a whole other slew of possible side effects and other problems. The tapeworm obviously gets a nice place to live and food, but the organism it lives in is harmed. Sometimes parasites have the ability to kill the organism that they're in. And I'm going to switch gears for a second here, and I'm going to talk about invasive species. Invasive species, you might have heard of that term before. It's also known as introduced species. It's where species are not native to their ecosystem, and because they're not native, they don't really belong there, and they don't really have any natural predators. And so they damage the environment. A really good example of that is the Asian carp. They are taking over rivers and lakes all throughout the country. These Asian carp here don't have any natural predators, and say they are just going to go ahead and reproduce willy-nilly, and thus there's going to be massive amounts of them. Because they are reproducing willy-nilly, they are using up the resources that the natural fish or the fish that were there before could have eaten. An interesting fact about these Asian carp, more people die from Asian carp every year than they do by bear attacks. You may be wondering why. It's kind of interesting. But if imagine a speeding boat going down a river, and these Asian carp, they like to jump. If that slaps somebody in the face, that's about a 30, 40-pound animal slapping somebody in the face at 40 miles an hour. That can cause some serious damage. And finally, guys, I want to talk about ecological succession. That is the shaping of ecosystems. Generally, this will follow a disturbance or some sort of mass destruction. So how does an ecosystem regenerate, basically? There is going to be a sequence of different changes. There's going to be regeneration, and then there's going to be new communities arise where there was previously no communities. A really good example of that is like a volcano. It's just going to wipe out the land, destroy the land, and then eventually they're going to be new plants. And those new plants now have the new spaces to live, new resources, and actually volcanic rock is actually very beneficial to plants, a lot of vitamins and minerals. Now, there are really only two types of succession. We'll call that the first kind primary succession, where it is started by pioneer species. When you think of pioneer, think of first, the first things. So here's a picture of succession, and it goes in a sort of linear path like this, where forests that you see that have a lot of trees that are really tall are actually old forests. And if you find an area where there's very small plants, those are actually new environments. These organisms down here, these mosses and lichens and very small plants like this, are capable of growing really quickly. And so if following, say, a volcano, those organisms are going to quickly show up. It takes a very long time of decomposition, forming that soil layer, and all of these things that eventually allow these larger trees to show up. So older forests have very large trees, which is why it's very crucial to protect them, because those forests are a lot harder to form naturally on Earth. The second succession is the secondary succession. I briefly talked about that, but that is where other species start to form an ecosystem. So we're talking about species occurring, here, here, and here. These species here are all species those are the primary succession species. Those can show up in an instant, but we need those guys to kind of break down, decompose, start to form some soil, and really start to allow larger plants to start to show up. Anyway, here, guys, that concludes ecological succession. Make sure you complete the Google form below. I'm signing off, folks. You all have a nice day.